Late night at the hospital, and the first signs of something wrong. At 12:20 a.m. On July 20th, I was so sleepy that my eyelids kept drooping and my head nodded again and again before I suddenly jolted awake. The harsh white lights of the emergency infusion hall stabbing my eyes and making them ache, while the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant. I blinked hard, straightened up, and stared at the IV bag hanging on the stand. Seeing that only a little liquid remained, at most 10 more minutes, I silently counted to myself, while my brother Brian was slumped asleep on the plastic chair beside me, his brow faintly furrowed, as his kidney stones had flared up at night, and left his face deathly pale with pain. So, we had rushed here by taxi, for scans, and the doctor said an IV drip was needed for pain relief, thankfully, almost finished now. Welcome to Panda's storyboard. Put on your headphones, get cozy, and settle in. Let's enjoy this story together. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. Now, let's begin. There were quite a few people in the infusion hall. The flu had been bad recently. Coughing rose and fell around us. Most people had their eyes closed resting, and only nurses occasionally moved through the space, checking the progress of drips. While outside the windows, the night was so dense, it seemed impossible to dissolve. Suddenly, a disturbance broke out beyond the hall. Chaotic footsteps, the shrill screech of a stretcher's wheels scraping across the floor, and doctors' urgent voices blending together, jolting my brother awake as he opened his eyes groggily and asked what was going on, why it was suddenly so noisy. I glanced outward, but with the infusion hall doors closed, I could only see shadows flickering in the corridor through the glass. So I whispered that it was probably an emergency patient arriving, and told him not to worry and to keep sleeping because the drip would be done soon. Yet he shook his head as his drowsiness faded a little, checked the IV bag, and said it was almost done. A few minutes later, the nurse came to remove the needle, pressing the puncture with a cotton swab, and I helped my brother stand, his steps still a bit unsteady, before we packed our things and slowly walked out. The hospital corridors in the early hours were brightly lit, yet carried an indescribable emptiness, our footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. And after turning a corner, we reached the emergency lobby, with the emergency rooms on the right, glowing even brighter and filled with noise. My brother happened to glance that way, and suddenly froze, gripping my arm tightly. And when I asked what was wrong, and followed his gaze, I saw a mobile hospital bed at the emergency room entrance, surrounded by several medical staff. A middle-aged man on the bed, struggling violently, his arms exposed and marked with deep, unmistakable bite wounds, whose edges had already darkened. 3 medical workers were restraining him, while another fumbled for restraints. But the man erupted with astonishing strength, broke free, and bit down hard on the nearest nurse's arm. A scream tearing through the air as more staff rushed in, 5 or 6 of them, finally forcing him back onto the bed and strapping him down, while the bitten nurse was helped aside with an arm mangled and bloody, blood streaming down the sleeve of the white coat. "Is that rabies?" I murmured, stunned by how terrifying a rabies attack could be. Yet my brother's face had gone unnaturally pale, as he pulled me along and hurried toward the exit. His voice pressed low as he urged me to leave at once. I stumbled from his force and protested that I'd just finished an IV and couldn't run, but he didn't answer, only dragged me through the emergency lobby toward the hospital doors, his pace quickening until I nearly had to jog to keep up, and just before we reached the exit, he whispered urgently that I hadn't noticed what was wrong with that patient. When I asked what he meant, he said with a trembling voice that the man had bitten off a chunk of the nurse's flesh, that it hadn't been simple biting, but a deliberate tearing away. And as I recalled the scene, I had to admit it hadn't looked like an ordinary bite. When I wondered aloud whether rabies could really be that severe, my brother stopped and looked at me with a seriousness I had never seen before, saying he didn't think it was rabies at all. And in that instant, I understood what he meant, exchanging a look without another word, as we both instinctively quickened our steps. Luckily, we had already booked a ride online, and as we pushed through the hospital's glass doors, the hot summer night rushed at us in sharp contrast to the cold air inside. A white sedan waiting by the curb, with the right license plate. My brother flung open the back door, almost shoved me inside, then climbed in himself, and told the driver to go, his voice steady but his clenched hands betraying his tension. And as the car pulled away, I looked back at the emergency department lights glaring in the darkness, with figures still moving inside. The city slid backward beyond the windows, neon lights flickering, everything appearing normal, yet a chill crept up my spine, and I shivered despite the heat. My mind replaying the crazed eyes of the man, the nurse's scream, the mangled wound, until we turned a corner and our familiar neighborhood came into view, calming me slightly. We got out at the gate, thanked the driver, and walked into an eerily quiet complex where only a few streetlights cast dim yellow halos. It was late on July 20th, or already the early hours of July 21st, and when we opened the door at home, the living room lights were still on, and our parents sprang up from the sofa with worry written all over their faces. My mother hurrying over to inspect my brother and ask whether the stone still hurt, to which he replied that the pain was mostly gone after the IV. Yet instead of going to rest as usual, he asked them to sit, because he had something important to say. After exchanging puzzled looks, they sat down. I joined them, and my brother took a deep breath and calmly described what we had seen in the emergency room. The frenzied man, the deep bite marks, the nurse with flesh torn away, the restraints, the screams and chaos, freezing the air in the room. My mother unconsciously clenched her clothes while my father, a high school biology teacher for over 20 years, grew grave at once and asked in a low voice whether my brother was sure the wounds were from human teeth. And when my brother confirmed it, adding there were at least 3 bite marks, and that the attack was a conscious tearing rather than uncontrolled biting, my father removed his glasses and rubbed his brow hard, saying that while rabies could cause aggression, the bite force shouldn't be that strong, and that by this description it didn't resemble any known disease. When my mother shakily asked if it could be a new virus spreading like COVID once had, my father replied with sharpened eyes that given the rapid onset, extreme aggression, and transmission through bites, if it were truly contagious, it would spread far faster than we imagined. We all fell silent, memories of the past too vivid, and my father finally stood and paced the room, declaring that if this was real, we had to act immediately. At 1:15 a.m., with the city outside still asleep, we divided tasks, my brother already fully focused, assigning my father and me to reinforce the house and prepare medicine and protective gear, while my mother and I handled food and water, deciding to order delivery first, since supermarkets were closed, and to buy everything shelf-stable from 24-hour convenience stores without revealing our exact address. Orders piled up quickly, and by 1:30 a.m. a shop owner called to confirm the large order, sounding sleepy but then excited, promising delivery in about 90 minutes, while my father and brother discussed reinforcing doors and windows, identifying glass as the weakest point, and planning to strengthen frames since replacing everything wasn't feasible, and assigning dawn trips to the building materials market and pharmacies. We waded through an agonizing stretch, watching the quiet complex, researching medical literature, counting supplies, until after 2 a.m. deliveries began arriving. Boxes of bottled water and instant food hauled inside trip after trip, filling the living room by 3 a.m., yet offering no real comfort, as we agreed this was only the beginning. We took shifts resting, and as the city remained unnervingly normal through the night, news feeds stayed silent about any hospital incident, making me even more uneasy. By dawn the sky lightened, birds sang, buses rumbled, elderly residents exercised below, and everything looked like an ordinary day, though for us it would be anything but. After a simple breakfast, we set out at 7, splitting up to markets, hardware stores, and pharmacies, my father warning us not to discuss the hospital incident or cause panic. And as my mother and I drove toward the wholesale food market, I noticed scattered, vague posts appearing on social platforms about a hospital disturbance and a patient biting people, quickly buried among other content. While the market itself was busier than usual, with many people hurriedly buying staples in bulk, barely checking prices, prompting my mother to murmur that perhaps others had heard rumors too, as we rushed through our list with no time to spare. At the wholesale market, we did not hesitate, and went straight to a supplier we knew well, and the boss handed over the household shopping list we had prepared the night before. He was a middle-aged, heavy-set man, and when he saw the list, his eyes lit up, and he joked that we must be opening a shop or buying for a work unit, while my mother calmly lied that it was an urgent need and asked whether delivery could be arranged that very morning, to which he rubbed his hands and said the morning would be a bit tight, but he would immediately arrange staff to pick the goods and try to deliver before noon. I passed him a slip of paper with the address written in advance. He agreed and turned toward the warehouse, shouting for people to come help. And while waiting for the big order to be picked, my mother and I walked another round of the market to supplement compressed biscuits, infant formula, vitamin tablets, water purification tablets, and various daily necessities. Everyone around us moved hurriedly, and from time to time, we caught fragments of conversation about something happening at the hospital. Relatives urging them to buy more rice, whispers about biting spoken very softly and dispersing at the slightest touch, yet leaving the air of the market inexplicably tense. 3 hours later, the truck arranged by the boss was fully loaded with all our goods. My mother and I drove our family car in front to lead the way, with the truck close behind. But at the last intersection before home, the traffic suddenly ground to a halt, prompting my mother to frown as she looked at the long line of cars ahead. With navigation showing we were only 2 intersections away, and normally 5 minutes from home. Yet now, time had become uncontrollable. I rolled down the window, trying to see what was happening, and could faintly see flashing police lights, traffic officers directing vehicles, and soon the sharp siren of an ambulance pierced the air as it sped past from the opposite lane toward the city center, exactly in the direction of the hospital we had visited the night before. And my mother and I exchanged a look without saying a word, as the air inside the car seemed to freeze, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. My phone vibrated with a message from the family group, saying they were almost done reinforcing the windows. Workers were installing security grills. Bulletproof glass was unavailable for now, so they were making do. And the front door had already been replaced with a sturdier one. I replied that we were stuck at the last intersection and would need some time. And my brother replied with just 2 words, telling us to wait. The wait felt unbearably long as I watched the minutes tick by while the cars ahead barely moved. A few impatient drivers honked, only to be quickly stopped by the police. And through the window I saw pedestrians gathered by the roadside, pointing at their phones and whispering, including a young woman with a pale face on the phone, saying in an excited raised voice that her friend worked at the hospital, and there had been biting patients since the night before her words were swallowed by traffic noise. Half an hour later, at 10:45 a.m., traffic finally began to move slowly under police guidance. And as we passed the intersection, we saw a black sedan with its side badly dented, as if struck by something heavy. With no blood on the ground and the damaged vehicle already towed aside, and 10 minutes later, we finally reached our residential gate. At that hour, the complex was quieter than usual, with most people at work or school or preparing lunch at home, the heat discouraging anyone from lingering outside, leaving only a few elderly people resting in the shade and a courier speeding past on an electric bike. And as our car and the truck stopped one after the other in front of our building, the smell of cooking drifted from the lower floors, the sounds and scents of ordinary life forming an eerie contrast with the screams in the emergency room the night before. The driver and workers began unloading, quickly piling goods into small mountains at the building entrance, and as my mother and I helped carry lighter items inside, a curious neighbor auntie peeked over and asked why we were buying so much, to which my mother calmly replied that we were preparing to move, never pausing her hands, and the woman shook her head and left without us knowing whether she believed it. Once unloading was finished and the truck drove off, we immediately messaged the family group that the goods had arrived and asked for help carrying them up. Within 2 minutes, my father and brother came down sweating heavily, my brother's arms still dusty from work. After my father nodded at the sight of the supplies and urged us to move quickly without attracting attention, the 4 of us worked in an assembly line, with the men handling heavy items and my mother and me carrying lighter boxes. The elevator was small and could only take a few boxes at a time, so we moved back and forth as efficiently as possible, encountering 2 neighbors along the way. One, a young man taking out trash who paused and joked whether these were benefits from a work unit, which my brother answered without batting an eye, and another, an upstairs auntie, who stared for a long time before slowly entering the elevator. At 2:07 p.m., the last barrel of water entered our home. My brother immediately shut the security door and locked the 3 newly installed chains, then slid down against the door and sat on the floor gasping, while the living room, dining area, and even part of the hallway were now occupied by supplies. Rice sacks stacked into half-human height walls, canned goods piled to the ceiling, and bottled water lining an entire wall, turning what had been a spacious home into a crowded warehouse. When my mother asked about the windows, my father wiped sweat away and said all had been fitted with security grills that would be hard to pry open from outside. My brother added that the front door had been replaced with a bank-grade security door, and that the balcony and kitchen windows had interlocks that could be sealed from inside. And as my mother inspected the newly installed grills on the balcony, she saw thick steel bars welded into a tight mesh, through which even a child's hand could not fit, with heavy blackout curtains pulled, so nothing inside could be seen from outside. As for medicine, my father pointed to the study and said they had bought most common drugs, including antibiotics, painkillers, disinfectants, as well as medical masks and protective suits. And in that moment, this house filled with food and water felt like a solid fortress that gave us brief reassurance. Though the silence outside was unsettling, I instinctively took out my phone and refreshed social media, watching posts explode in number with each refresh, as keywords shifted from acute neurological syndrome to more blunt words like biting, madness, and monsters. And one post caught my eye, from a local user located about 5 kilometers away, claiming an accident outside their complex, where a white sedan hit a barrier. The driver crawled out covered in blood, moved strangely, and then pounced on a young woman riding an electric bike at a crosswalk. With a blurry video attached that showed a ragged man pinning a figure down, while people ran around, the background recognizable as a commercial intersection in our city. Just as I was about to open the comments, the page refreshed and said the content had been deleted. And when I searched for the account, it no longer existed, prompting me to mutter that the censorship was fast, as I clenched my phone until my knuckles turned white. After being awake all night, my mother forced me to sleep for a while, saying my dark circles were frightening. And as soon as I lay down and closed my eyes, my consciousness faded, and I fell into a nightmare, where the man from the emergency room sat by my bed, with his face so close I could see his cloudy eyes and the dark veins beneath his skin. His mouth splitting as dark red blood, mixed with saliva, dripped onto my face in cold, sticky drops, jolting me awake in a gasp as I sat up in the darkness and touched my face to confirm it was dry and that I was still in my room. Outside the window, the light was dim, and it was already evening, the house quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioner, and everything seemed normal. Dinner was simple, with little appetite among us, my father saying we were all too tired and should rest well tonight and see how things develop tomorrow, while I, having slept in the afternoon, felt no sleepiness at all. After 9 p.m., I quietly opened my door, walked barefoot to the balcony without turning on the lights, sat on a small chair, and looked through the gaps in the security grill at the scene below, where city neons still flickered. Traffic on the main road formed a red ribbon of taillights. People moved about the complex walking dogs. Commuters hurried past, and a few high school-aged kids laughed as they crossed a path, everything appearing normal. I unlocked my phone and scrolled through moments, seeing a colleague post a dinner photo captioned with plain happiness, followed by a classmate sharing travel scenery and sentiments of peaceful times. And when I searched social platforms again for those daytime keywords like biting and hospital, nothing appeared, leaving only official notices and trivial news, making me wonder whether it was all suppressed or truly resolved. As I put the phone down and looked toward the garden, lit yellow by streetlights and the sparkling fountain pool, a scream suddenly ripped through the night from the lawn, and a stiff, oddly postured figure burst from behind the bushes and lunged at a young man walking his dog, knocking him down as the leash slipped from his hand, and the toy poodle barked frantically and bit at the attacker's pant leg without any effect, while the attacker buried his head into the young man, and the screams faded from shrill to hoarse before disappearing altogether. After a brief stunned pause, nearby walkers scattered in panic, some running while calling on their phones, others stumbling and getting back up. And seconds later, the bitten young man staggered to his feet with the same stiff movements as his attacker. His neck twisted to one side and his shoulder darkened as he turned toward the nearest fleeing person and began to chase, with the poodle still circling his legs in confused whimpers. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping softly, and hurried inside to knock on my parents' door and then my brother's, whispering urgently but clearly that something had happened. And soon the four of us gathered on the balcony, huddled in the curtain's shadow to see that below everything had changed, with the first attacker chasing and biting a woman who ran toward our building, only to fail to open the access door and beat on the glass, while the bitten dog owner tackled a passing delivery rider and they rolled together. And farther off at the complex gate, several unsteady figures were shuffling in with unnatural postures. Because it was night and most residents were indoors, there were not many of those things roaming below. And though neon lights still glowed in the distance and traffic noise drifted faintly, making the city night seem prosperous, right before our eyes in this familiar place, hell had begun, with my father's hand gripping my shoulder tightly, my brother's breathing growing heavy, my mother covering her mouth, and none of us speaking as we watched the woman at the door slow, and the delivery bike's turn signal blink, and the bewildered dog circle its owner. We knew this was no longer a distant world in the news or vague online rumor. because it had arrived right downstairs. And when my phone buzzed with an emergency notice from the city command center announcing a new highly contagious virus that caused loss of reason and indiscriminate aggression, spread through bodily fluid contact, urging all citizens to stop going out, lock doors and windows, remain silent, and wait patiently as officials organized rescue, the cold official language finally acknowledged the aggression and contagion, and I handed the phone to my family as we stood wordless. Outside, the swaying figures cast grotesque shadows under the streetlights, and suddenly heart-rending cries came from the opposite building as a woman shouted for her father to come up, leaning halfway out of a seventh-floor window, while below, a middle-aged man was surrounded by three staggering figures and quickly knocked down despite swinging his briefcase, drawing more cries until the sound abruptly stopped and the window slammed shut, too late, as more figures emerged from the shadows, drawn by the noise, gathering under the building and ramming their bodies against the glass doors with dull thuds. We held our breath, watching the horror across the way, and that night no one slept, taking turns observing through narrow gaps as the number of those things below seemed to slowly increase. Occasionally, distant screams or the sounds of heavy impacts drifted over, and every single one made our hearts clench tightly, until the early hours when the zombies beneath the opposite building finally dispersed after feeding, though a few still lingered stubbornly near the unit entrance. The next morning, the world was wrapped in an eerie silence, with no usual traffic noise, no children's laughter, no breakfast vendors shouting, only the rustle of wind through leaves and some dragging, irregular footsteps, while the sunlight was bright and streamed through gaps in the curtains, forming a sharp beam of light across the room. I cautiously lifted one quarter of the curtain and looked outside, and in the sunlight, the scene inside the residential complex was cruelly clear. Several mangled bodies lay on the lawn, dark blood already dried and blackened, and there were more zombies wandering than the night before, aimlessly moving along roads and through gardens, some in tattered clothes, others bearing horrific wounds, with one zombie stuck at the top of a children's slide, futilely waving its arms. At least 20 zombies were roaming directly below our building, occasionally bumping into parked cars and setting off alarms. The piercing sounds drawing more zombies until the batteries died or the vehicles were smashed beyond recognition. And overnight, the world had changed. "Try not to make any noise," my father whispered, saying that we had caused too much commotion buying supplies yesterday, and now had to keep a low profile, while my mother checked her phone, long since set to silent, and opened the residents' group chat, which was already in chaos, with messages demanding to know if property management was dead, why the gates hadn't been closed in advance, what to do if they hadn't stocked food, whether property management could deliver supplies, pleas to rescue family members trapped downstairs, desperate requests for water at 10 times the price, and finally a message from a woman, begging to open the door for her husband who was downstairs, insisting he could still walk, and was only frightened. The chat went silent for a few seconds, before exploding with accusations, calling her insane, citing official notices about contagion, threatening to throw her out first if she dared open the door, demanding administrators remove her, and by afternoon, gunfire suddenly rang out outside, not sporadic shots, but rhythmic, dense bursts, mixed with shouted commands over loudspeakers. We rushed to the balcony and peered through the curtain gaps to see several army green trucks slowly entering the main road outside the complex. Soldiers in camouflage, standing on the roofs firing controlled bursts at wandering zombies, each crisp gunshot dropping one, while workers in white protective suits followed behind, swiftly bagging bodies in black body bags and loading them onto another truck. "It's the military," my brother whispered, unable to hide his excitement, and we watched as the zombies below were cleared one by one, until the final shot echoed and the main road fell empty again, leaving only dark stains on the ground. The internet erupted instantly, with the residents group filling with fireworks emojis and cheers, praising the authorities and expressing hope that normalcy would soon return. And soon afterward, military trucks stopped by each building, as soldiers in protective suits placed boxes of supplies at the unit entrances and announced via loudspeakers for residents to come down in batches to collect them while keeping distance. We stood behind the curtains, watching the activity below, seeing ample supplies of rice, flour, vegetables, bottled water, and some medicine. And when my mother quietly asked whether we should go collect ours, my father shook his head and said no, that we should pretend no one was home, since we had claimed to be moving, and going down now would draw attention. So We silently watched the supplies placed at our unit entrance, and then watched neighbors cautiously come down to carry their shares away, while utilities and internet remained stable, and official media began reporting progress on clearing operations across the city, claiming the situation was under effective control, making us almost regret buying so much, as my mother softly wondered whether it might really be ending, and whether we had overreacted. Hope began to grow, and we even secretly discussed that perhaps in a week or two, life might return to normal. But the turning point came on the afternoon of the fourth day, when a sudden summer rainstorm arrived, the sky dark as night, and rain hammering against the windows, before merging into a solid curtain that blurred the outside world. Standing by the window watching the downpour, I even felt a trace of relief, thinking the rain might wash away the blood and filth from the streets and leave them clean again. But as the rain eased from a deluge to a steady fall, and I was about to look away, I froze, staring at the city's main road outside, where dense figures were moving in the rain, not a few, but hundreds or thousands, forming a slow gray-black tide of bodies. They all tilted their heads upward, with faces turned to the sky, as if welcoming the rain, and ahead of their path were several military trucks whose soldiers were firing, muzzle flashes flickering in the dim rain, yet there were simply too many zombies, as those in front fell and were instantly replaced by those behind, advancing without fear or hesitation toward the gunfire and human presence. More terrifying still, they seemed to employ a crude strategy, with some peeling off to flank the sides and forming a loose encirclement that trapped the last truck, while soldiers on the other trucks tried to rescue it with full firepower, only to be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, as rain, gunfire, and a low collective rasping sound blended together. Eventually, an order seemed to be given, the remaining trucks reversing and accelerating to break through and retreat, while the surrounded truck ceased firing, its doors torn open from outside, as struggling figures were dragged out and swallowed by the zombie mass, only to stand back up minutes later with stiff, swaying movements and join the wandering horde. When the rain finally stopped and sunlight pierced the clouds, shining on the wet streets and that vast, slowly moving zombie crowd, steam rose and refracted into an illusory halo that made the scene even more horrifying, and my heart sank as if submerged in icy water, cooling completely. The spark of hope that had just ignited online was utterly extinguished by that rain, and messages flooded in, asking where so many zombies came from, whether they emerged from underground, whether others had noticed they appeared en masse during rain, and demanding explanations from the authorities. Until an hour later, an official notice finally pushed to every phone, stating that infected individuals showed a clear tendency toward precipitation, gathering and moving toward densely populated areas during rainfall, urging citizens to remain vigilant, secure doors and windows, maintain silence, and trust that despite unprecedented difficulties, rescue efforts continued. There was no apology, no detailed explanation, only cold phrases about unprecedented difficulty and maintaining confidence, and the residents' group fell deathly silent. Neighbors who minutes before had been discussing what they wanted to eat once things ended, now collectively voiceless, until eventually a once active young mother asked desperately what to do because her daughter had a fever, and no one replied. We looked at the mountain of supplies in our living room, and no one thought we had bought too much anymore. On the 11th day, the power went out, night falling without warning as darkness swallowed everything, and my father said the authorities might have been critically hit, a statement no one refuted, because if any organizational capacity remained, basic electricity would not have been cut so completely. On the 13th day, the taps released their final drops of murky liquid before running dry, followed by the disappearance of all phone signal bars and the collapse of the network, marking the breakdown of basic support systems and a full paralysis of society, truly entering an era of unprecedented hardship. On the 23rd day, it rained again, lightly this time, but I felt a chill deep in my bones as I hid behind the curtains, watching with my heart pounding, seeing the zombies below pause briefly in the rain before lifting their heads and flaring their nostrils as if sniffing, no longer wandering aimlessly, but showing purpose. A street-side convenience store with glass doors and windows became their target, as over a dozen zombies staggered over and began slamming their bodies against the glass in a relentless rhythm, until cracks formed and the glass shattered with a crash, screams bursting briefly from inside before being drowned by the sounds of zombies flooding in, and soon, several new stiff figures emerged to join those outside. Using the same method, they began checking street-level shops and ground-floor apartments, with 2 ground-floor units in our complex having their windows smashed. What happened inside? Something we dared not imagine. Only seeing new zombies later join the roaming groups, prompting my father to grimly conclude that they had become more sensitive to scent, especially in the rain, possibly because rain enhanced some form of perception. We sealed every gap with tape, terrified of even the slightest trace of human scent escaping. Yet the seed of fear had already taken root, and we began to dread rain itself, dreading the damp air as a beacon for the zombies. On the 44th day, during a heavy, oppressive afternoon, dull thuds echoed from below, and when we rushed to the balcony and looked down through the gaps, we saw 2 twisted bodies lying on the concrete, blood slowly spreading. A man and a woman who had jumped from mid to lower floors, neatly dressed in home clothes, and after a long time, no zombies were drawn to them, likely because unmoving bodies without fresh scent held no interest. We retreated silently to the living room, my mother covering her mouth with trembling shoulders, not out of sorrow for the dead, but from a despair born of seeing our own possible fate, because though we were not short of food or water, the daily confinement, fear, lack of hope, and uncertainty about an endless future were more tormenting than hunger. On the 68th day, it rained again, a sudden summer thunderstorm, turning the world into a white curtain of rain. And once more, the zombies collectively faced the sky, motionless, as the rain washed over them. But after it stopped and steam rose, we saw they had changed. Their movements were no longer so slow or stiff. Their pace quickened, even coordinated, and suddenly, one zombie accelerated and charged a ground-floor balcony with security grills, grabbing the bars and beginning to climb. Clumsy, but unmistakably climbing, while second-floor windows were violently struck, and terrified screams and crashing sounds erupted inside. Not just in one place, but across several buildings, as weaker defenses failed. Screams rising and then abruptly cutting off. We lived on the 15th floor, yet at that moment an icy chill surged from my feet to my head, because they had evolved speed, strength, and climbing ability, and I could not stop wondering what they would evolve next, whether one day, even the 15th floor would no longer be safe. On the 75th day, someone finally broke, as a man suddenly opened his unit door, screaming wildly as he rushed out unarmed toward the nearest zombie group. His face twisted between laughter and tears, and after a brief struggle, he was torn apart, only to stand back up later with his neck crooked at an unnatural angle, and join the wandering horde. He didn't want to die, my brother murmured, saying he simply didn't want to live like this. And I suddenly recalled an old internet meme about joining what you cannot defeat, realizing he had succeeded in joining. The zombies continued to multiply, from a few scattered ones to those bitten soldiers and lower-floor residents, until over 100 figures roamed the complex, many faces hauntingly familiar as neighbors once met in elevators, elderly people seen during morning exercises, and even the always-smiling convenience store owner. On the 94th day, another autumn rain fell, and the temperature dropped noticeably, the zombies' rain-time ritual lasting even longer, and afterward, as I observed carefully, I noticed something chilling. A form of order had emerged among them. Several zombies, wearing tattered military uniforms, clearly occupied leadership roles, emitting low hisses that made others stop and turn toward them, while differences existed among the rest, with one zombie in a shredded suit, likely a former office worker, seeming able to direct a few in ordinary clothes, and another in a security guard's uniform, managing a specific area, prompting my father to suck in a sharp breath and say they were forming hierarchies based on their roles in life. My brother's face drained of color as he whispered that if there was hierarchy, if there was order, this meant that they had memories, or at least retained part of their social cognition, and this conclusion plunged all of us into an icy abyss, because having memories meant they might remember how to open doors, how to use tools, even how to pry locks and destroy more complex barriers. So we rechecked every line of defense in our home, and discovered in despair that if what we were facing were enemies with intelligence, memory, coordination, and the ability to use tools, then just how long could our security doors and window grills really hold? On the 101st day, my brother suddenly grabbed me during a routine observation and pointed toward the children's playground downstairs, telling me to look at what they were doing. And when I leaned closer to the window, I saw 3 zombie soldiers standing on the highest platform of the colorful plastic slide, while below them, layers of zombies surrounded the slide, in a rough circle, with zombies wearing suits, security uniforms, and other signs of former status standing in the inner ring, and ordinary zombies quietly positioned on the outside, with no roaring and no swaying at all. One of the 3 soldier zombies tilted his head back and emitted a series of long and short howls that were clearer than usual, not the frenzied cries of an attack, but more like issuing commands, and the zombies below listened in silence, after which the soldier zombie jumped down from the slide and began walking toward the residential complex gate, while the others immediately turned and followed, not dispersing to wander as they usually did, but forming a loosely ordered yet unified column that moved forward silently. "Where are they going?" my mother asked nervously, and we held our breath as we watched the zombie formation pass through the complex, exit the gate, and then turn toward the neighboring community park, which had a small plaza and a grassy area barely visible from the side angle of our balcony, where the 3 soldier zombies climbed onto a decorative stone at the center of the park, and the leader once again let out a piercing, far-carrying howl. What followed was a scene we would never forget, as zombies converged from all directions, those that had followed from our complex, others emerging from winding streets, and still more appearing from the shadows of distant buildings, all flowing silently and resolutely toward that small park, as if responding to a single unified summons, until the park quickly filled up, and the later arrivals stopped on the surrounding streets and roads, all facing the center of the park, motionless, thousands upon thousands, forming a dense, gray-black, rigid, soundless sea. They gathered there without attacking, without howling, simply gathering, and my voice trembled as I asked what this was, while my brother struggled to say the words, "a meeting," or perhaps an assembly, and my father's face was ashen as he said that whatever it was, their behavior was becoming more and more like that of an organized collective. When we thought the zombies were gathering to prepare a new purge of humans, time instead delivered a completely different and unbelievable answer, because they did not move. And half an hour passed with them frozen like a forest of gray-black statues across the park and surrounding streets. Then, 3 hours passed, as the sky shifted from afternoon to dusk, and still they did not budge. And 6 hours later, night fell completely, with no moonlight, only their silent outlines submerged in darkness. We took turns observing through night vision binoculars, and those figures truly seemed nailed to the ground, without even the slightest sway, leaving my brother to ask in confusion what they were doing, whether hibernating or undergoing some kind of collective punishment, though no one could answer, as this exceeded all our fear-based projections. 18 hours passed, and a new day arrived with glaring sunlight, yet they still stood there, exposed in broad daylight with no shelter and no reaction, while occasional silhouettes of survivors flickered in distant high-rise windows, likely just as stunned by the bizarre sight. And so 1 day, 2 days, 3 days went by, until day 117, when they had already been standing there for a full 16 days. During those 16 days, apart from the 3 leading soldier zombies, who would, at fixed times, slowly patrol once around the perimeter of the horde and emit a few low, order-maintaining howls, all the other zombies, numbering in the thousands, remained as if paused, maintaining the exact postures and formations they had held at the moment of assembly, unmoving, without feeding, wandering, or attacking any living creature that appeared in their field of view. And we even witnessed a stray cat boldly slip past the edge of the horde without eliciting any reaction. A suffocating, immense silence replaced the once ubiquitous howling and dragging footsteps, and this silence was more unsettling than noise, as if they were waiting for something, a command, a moment, or some change beyond our understanding. On the morning of day 122, I was awakened by the sound of rain outside the window, a cold, steady drizzle of late autumn, and my heart sank, because every rainfall had meant zombie evolution in the past, and this time was no exception, so I rushed to the balcony through the rain, and saw the horde in the park react as all the zombies uniformly tilted their heads back toward the gray sky to receive the falling rain. The rain streamed down their rigid faces and tattered clothes, and on their exposed skin I could see an eerie, deeper blue-gray sheen, as if their muscles had grown more solid, while the formation stirred faintly, like instinct struggling against some constraint, until one of the soldier zombies on the decorative stone released a more authoritative, penetrating howl that quelled the disturbance. They maintained their upturned posture until the rain weakened and finally stopped, then slowly lowered their heads and returned to that absolute stillness, even more tranquil than before, as if the brief replenishment had only been for the sake of waiting better. Waiting for what, we wondered, and the answer arrived faster and more shockingly than we expected, because about 2 hours after the rain stopped, the long unheard roar of helicopters echoed across the sky, not one or two, but dozens arriving from different directions and hovering above the park and surrounding areas, followed by the heavy rumble of tank treads rolling along the ground. As green armored vehicles advanced in encirclement along the main roads, their hulls caked with mud and scars of battle, clearly having endured fierce fighting and long travel. The official forces were back. Or rather, they finally had the ability to deal with this enormous and bizarre horde. And the zombies reacted as those closest to the army seemed stimulated by the noise and advancing steel behemoths, their bodies leaning forward and throats emitting low, threatening growls as instinct urged them to pounce. At that critical moment, the soldier zombie standing at the highest point let out an unprecedented, piercingly shrill, almost mocking scream that tore through the air and even overwhelmed the roar of helicopters and engines. And a miracle occurred, as all the zombies on the brink of riot froze as if a power switch had been flipped. Then, amid the soldier zombies' continuous howls with a rapid rhythm, they slowly made a movement that left all of us dumbstruck, as they abandoned any attacking or defensive posture, let their arms drop, lowered their heads, and some even slowly knelt down, not in submission to force, but more like an act of surrender. The army was clearly stunned, and the offensive paused briefly before orders were given, and the first gunshots sounded like the breaking of a seal, followed immediately by gunfire and artillery erupting like a torrential storm, as flames and smoke swallowed the park and surrounding streets. The zombies endured it all in silence, without counterattacking, dodging, or fleeing, simply standing or kneeling in place as bullets pierced them and shells tore them apart, like a lifeless wheat field awaiting harvest, while the 3 soldier zombies stood tall on the decorative stone, facing the oncoming fire until they too were consumed by flames. This unequal battle, or rather this cleansing, lasted a full day and night, and the shelling continued for a full day and night, while our family watched from the 15th floor window almost the entire time, without speaking or leaving, every explosion detonating in our hearts. When the final gunshot faded and the smoke slowly dispersed in the morning breeze, the park and surrounding streets had become a ruin, pocked with craters and charred wreckage, the dense, motionless gray-black mass gone, and at least this area's zombies had been eliminated. My father's rigid posture suddenly wavered as he raised his hand to cover his face, his shoulders trembling uncontrollably as tears seeped through his rough fingers, and his choked words were barely recognizable as he said that they had become like that, yet were still protecting him. A sentence left unfinished, but fully understood by all of us. Those soldiers, after losing their sanity and becoming walking corpses, after undergoing bizarre evolution and seemingly regaining fragments of memory, had ultimately created, through this silent, self-sacrificial assembly and stillness, the most ideal firing range for humanity's purge, completing in the most tragic way the mission they could not finish in life, to protect the people and eliminate threats. Over the rain-washed ruins, scorched earth blended into unrecognizable colors beneath an overcast sky. Yet something had changed after this brutal and solemn cleansing, as within the icy despair seeped a burning pain and respect born of humanity, proving that even in utter darkness and mutation, some things had never truly died. The ruins after the shelling steamed with the last wisps of smoke under thin autumn sunlight, and sporadic gunfire could still be heard in the distance as the military carried out final purges in other areas, adopting swift, zoned operations against remaining zombie activity, with helicopters circling daily to broadcast progress and warnings. For areas like our complex, which had seen little activity after that shocking self-cleansing, a different kind of order was rebuilt as cordons were set up, professional disinfection teams in full protective suits moved in, and white disinfected fog blanketed buildings and streets for days, followed by the establishment of 24-hour guard posts manned by soldiers and community workers. The most critical change was the resumption of scheduled supply distribution, and though we still did not go downstairs, we watched through gaps in the curtains as temporary distribution points appeared every few days in the open space below, where neighbors lined up sparsely and far apart, their faces gaunt and eyes sunken, yet no longer lifeless. When they accepted those modest but vital supplies, their eyes shimmered with tears of survival and a rekindled light of hope. And yes, hope was no longer distant, as it existed right downstairs, in the hands of those workers in protective suits who tried to distribute supplies gently, in the increasingly regular helicopter noise overhead, and in the gunfire that grew sparse and then vanished entirely. Our household supplies were still ample, giving us confidence to continue observing without rushing to expose ourselves during the initial chaos and inspections. And my father said to wait a little longer, until order became more stable. A wait made easier, because each day brought tangible improvement. Nearly 2 more months passed, and on a calm afternoon, the fluorescent light overhead flickered without warning, and then shone steadily. And 2 days after the electricity returned, the long-absent signal bars slowly but firmly reappeared on our phone screens. The moment the network reconnected, information flooded social media as survivors poured out their emotions in every way imaginable, with lengthy technical accounts, incoherent gratitude, countless weary yet smiling selfies, missing person notices, and memorials for the fallen, a spectrum of human experience pointing to a single word: alive. We devoured it all, feeling as though these words and images reconnected us to a world long lost. As good news followed in rapid succession, with constantly updated purge progress and daily expansion of safe zone maps. Half a month later, on one morning, all broadcast channels, phone notifications, and even the long silent community loudspeakers simultaneously announced the long-awaited message that through the unremitting efforts of the military and civilians nationwide, as of midnight that day, no active infected remained within the country, and a complete zeroing had been achieved. There was no cheering or thunderous noise, only silence in our home as we looked at one another, my mother covering her mouth as tears rolled down soundlessly, my father removing his reading glasses and rubbing his reddened eyes, and my brother letting out a long, heavy breath, as if releasing all the accumulated weight. I walked to the window and looked at the streets below, still enclosed by cordons, yet clearly regaining vitality, my vision blurring, and on the 200th day, the first snow fell without warning, gentle flakes covering the charred ruins and masking the dark scars that could never be fully erased, turning the broken world white and quiet once more. It was also on that day that the lockdown was lifted, the guard posts remaining but the barricades removed, with workers in protective suits standing to the side. Every survivor who cautiously stepped out of their unit door underwent simple registration and a health check. And our family finally walked out as well, the cold, crisp air rushing into our lungs with a faint metallic scent of blood, the thin layer of snow crunching underfoot with a soft squeak. There were not many people in the residential complex, and we nodded to one another from a distance, meeting eyes that held the complex mix of emotions only those who had passed through the same abyss could understand: grief, relief, bewilderment, and a carefully guarded sense of hope. The streets were being cleared, construction machinery stood by near the ruins, and in the distance long unseen civilian vehicles moved slowly along, while the sky was a clear gray blue after the snowfall. New life, like the land covered by fresh snow, lay blank before us, yet filled with infinite possibilities. The future remained unknown and the road to rebuilding would be long, but at least in this moment, we were alive, we had walked out, and we had welcomed a new first day.